Contrary to popular belief, it is not just husbands who suffer from the disease, the affliction called selective hearing. I know. Oftentimes it's the husbands who are the ones that are named publicly for suffering from that terrible affliction. But truth be told, it's not just husbands that struggle with the ability to truly listen and to hear everything rather than just what one wants to hear. No, today's gospel reminds us that disciples struggle with selective hearing as well. It's what gets Peter into trouble today. It's what makes Peter an obstacle to Jesus. It's the reason why Jesus needs to take Peter aside. And notice how Jesus does that. Jesus does not publicly humiliate Peter in front of the other disciples. You and I can learn a lot from that approach. But oftentimes when someone needs correction, when someone needs a talking to, it's oftentimes best to do it one-on-one, apart from the crowd, apart from others. So Jesus does just that. And the reason why he does that is because Peter gets himself, remember last week he got it right, well this week he puts his foot in his mouth. And the reason why Peter does that is because, of course, he's not listening. He missed the end of the story. And you and I do as well. You see, Peter was so shook up. His heart was beating so loudly when Jesus was telling him the part about going to Jerusalem and being rejected by the scribes and the Pharisees and the elders and having to suffer and to be killed. Well, by that point, Peter's heart was beating so heavily and so hard and was so anxious that he missed the last part. And I bet you and I did as well. Because the last part is this: and that on the third day I shall rise again. Peter missed. He didn't hear the part about the resurrection because he was so overwhelmed, he was so concerned, he was so taken back by the fact that Jesus was going to be rejected, that he was going to have to suffer, that he was going to be killed, that because of all of that, why all of a sudden Peter just shut down and he stopped listening. And so once Peter hears all this, he does what any friend would do. He wants to save Jesus. He wants to protect Jesus. He wants to preserve Jesus from all of this hardship and suffering and rejection and ultimately death. Peter wants something better for his friend, Jesus the Christ. And certainly we do as well, because we think the answer to suffering and adversity and trials and rejection and difficulties and people not listening to us when we truly want them to hear us, we think the answer is then just to simply box it all up, save ourselves from the trouble. Why bother after all? It won't do any good anyway. And yet Jesus' message for you and I today is to hear the full message. That suffering and rejection and death, while certainly that is part of Jesus' journey of going to Jerusalem, and that's going to happen anytime you and I, like Jeremiah, speak on behalf of God. Speaking for God is dangerous, it is anything but pleasant, and it is certainly not enjoyable. Jeremiah reminds us of that in today's first reading. You duped me, Lord, and I let myself be duped. And yet, there's something about God's message. There's something about God's will, as Paul reminds us and prays that we might discern God's will, what is perfect and pleasing and right. There's something about once we figure out God's will, which is the same, by the way, for all of us, no matter what our occupation is, no matter what our vocation is, God's will is the same for all of us. You know what it is. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. That is God's will. That is God's dream for us. That is God's big idea. And you and I, anytime we strive to live that out in its fullest sense of the word, we are going to experience rejection, and we are going to experience ridicule, and we are going to experience people who will have nothing to do with us, but rather they'd simply like us to be gone. And yet that should not be a cause for you and I to lose hope, a cause for you and I not to be true disciples. But again, we need to remember the message, the full story, that yes, even though there might be ridicule and rejection and even the death of a relationship because of our desire to love God and to love others completely and fully, Jesus reminds us that the full story is that there will always be life after death. There will always be the resurrection. There will always be the end of the story, because love is more powerful than death. So you and I gather today, and we strive to live out the verse from the opening song that we sang today. Nourish us, Lord, with your sacred story. Nourish us with your sacred story till we can finally claim it as our own. Nourish us with your sacred story till we can finally claim it as our own. That, my friends, is what we are called to do. But we need to claim the entire story. Let us not just stop listening to the story because it becomes too frightening, but rather in remembering and listening to the whole story. Why, then you and I have the courage. We have the courage to go out. We have the courage to do God's will. We have the courage to speak for God, even though at times it's unpleasant and anything but enjoyable.